Hi, I'm Dr. Young. Welcome to the class History 262, Introduction to Africa at Flagler College, summer semester A, term A 2017, sorry. The purpose of this lecture, or this recording, is to introduce you to the syllabus, to talk about some strategies for succeeding in the class. I do apologize that I'm having to do this remotely. But given my schedule with the conference I had to attend, there's really no way around this. So hopefully this will be helpful. We have in front of us here on the screen the syllabus. You all should have received this in an email. Please note the class time and the meeting place. This fulfills a general education requirement in Foundations of Knowledge, Section B, under Studies of Cultures. It is writing intensive, excuse me, and counts as a writing intensive class. Please note my information. In the summers, I do not hold regular office hours, but I am almost always in my office right after this class for at least a little while. Please email me or talk to me before or after class to set up an appointment if you'd like to discuss things outside of class. The course description, this course surveys, and it really is a survey. It's a broad overview. We will get into some specifics. We will post-hole, as I like to say. That is, we will dig deeper into some parts of African history. But it surveys African history from ancient times through the present. It may sound strange to hear that Africa has an ancient past. In fact, it does. In some places, Egypt, for instance, Africa gave rise to some of the earliest civilizations, large-scale civilizations. In other places in Africa, life was operated a little differently, but we can still refer to this as civilization. We have to understand that it's an oral culture, that it doesn't operate with written records. It's a little more difficult to get into, perhaps due to the difficulty of the source material, but it's still something that we can access through various means. This will come all the way through the present then, with a particular emphasis on the political and cultural development of the African continent. And I should put in there that as we get closer and closer to the present, we will also focus a lot on economics, because politics and economics are very closely bound up together in especially the 19th and 20th centuries, though even in some parts of Africa long before that. One thing that's problematic, I think, about this course description is that it says African history. Africa is a huge continent. Second largest continent in the world, both in land mass and in population, at least these days. That hasn't always been the case for the population. Africa was, for much of its history, actually quite underpopulated. But the land mass is gigantic, and it's diverse. One of the first assignments you're going to have is to learn something about African geography. And one thing you will note from that study, hopefully, is the great diversity of geography of this continent. We have everything from some of the driest deserts in the world to some of the densest rainforests in the world, to huge grasslands, to coastal regions, Mediterranean climate coastal regions, to mountains that reach almost 20,000 feet. And so just as the other continents of the world produced a great deal of diversity in terms of human life, as well as the topography and environment, Africa is no exception to that. Africa is not a country. That's one of the misconceptions, kind of popular misconceptions that many people have about it. It is a vast continent. For a long time, maps were often drawn such that the size of Africa was de-emphasized and the size of Europe was made much larger than it really is, even to show Europe as roughly the size of Africa. In actuality, Europe could fit, I think, more than twice into Africa. It was still room left over. Something like 3 continental United States could fit into Africa, and so This is a huge continent, and there's a tremendous amount of diversity. So we can't deal with all of that in this class. This is a one semester, or in this case, one summer term class. We have just a few weeks to look at this. And so we will do a sampling, while we will also try to cover chronologically the whole scope of African history. So students should leave the class having obtained the following knowledge and skills. The ability to engage the African past with a critical, analytical eye, as well as the capacity to express your analysis and opinions both orally and in writing. This class is a general education class, and as such, it is about learning how to think critically. Critical analysis is the goal, just as it is in many of the other general education classes. And you might ask, okay, how do I learn to think critically about the past? Well, in fact, critical analysis is part and parcel of history, of the discipline of history. We learn to generate opinions about the way that people lived, why they did the things that they did. Those are the kinds of questions that historians or students of history are interested in. Naturally, because the source record, whether we're talking about written records or archaeology or other sources, because the source record is always incomplete, that is, it does not give us a divine perspective on human life, an absolutely omnipresent, omniscient understanding of everything that happened. Of course, that would be absurd to even think that way. Our record is incomplete. And so, the things that happened in history, particularly the why of history, the why things happened the way they did, is something that is up for a great deal of debate. And so that's where our critical analysis comes in. We need to learn to engage sources from the past and equip ourselves with enough information about the historical context of the past so that we can learn to interpret the behavior of past peoples through the remains that they leave behind for us in the form of written or oral records or archaeology or other evidences that we will discuss. This class hopefully will help you gain, as it says in the second one here, a knowledge of and appreciation for the various civilizations of the African continent in their various historical layers. This is a biased perspective, I think, that I adopt in this course, but I have a great deal of affection for the African continent. I kind of came of age there. When I was 19 years old, I moved. I was working for a religious organization, actually, and moved to southern Africa for 2 years. I lived in South Africa and Botswana, and I visited the country of Lesotho numerous times. And I really matured there and gained a great love for the people of Africa. Find the continent absolutely beautiful in terms of human life, as well as flora and fauna and kind of environmental diversity and all of that. And I think that Africa is misunderstood and greatly underappreciated in the modern world. And so, I come into this class as an advocate for the continent and hope that students will learn to appreciate it so that they may sort of extend the advocacy that I try to have for this. And so take that however you will. But I do think that Africa has a lot to offer in terms of, our understanding or our critical thinking about human beings and human behavior. There are some wonderful case studies that we'll look at for this. And Africa, of course, has produced a fascinating culture and interesting political and economic systems that are worthy of our attention. Third point here, one of the learning outcomes is the ability to examine other cultures and time periods on their terms, rejecting ethnocentrism and anachronism. I believe that students of history should respect those whom they study and judge their actions according to their conceptions of the world and not from some predetermined notion of modern superiority or progress. It's always the temptation, I think, to look at the past and say, I'm glad I didn't live back then, or why did they do things that way? That's weird, or why didn't they just think the way that I do? And maybe we even do this a bit unconsciously or subconsciously. A good student of history will move beyond what might be called presentism. That is, judging the past with the understandings that come from the present, and realizing, as one famous historian put it, the past is a foreign country. It's a different place. They do things differently there. And so we need to learn to think like people of the past do. And I think this is especially the case for Africa, where the culture was so vastly different. Their basic assumptions about the way the world worked were so vitally different that if we take an ethnocentric perspective, or if we take an anachronistic perspective, anachronistic means out of time, that is, we adopt the sensibilities of one time period, that is our time period, and try to apply them to past time periods, we're not only going to misunderstand, but we're going to miss out on opportunities for learning that could be potentially really valuable. So keep that in mind. To get to all of this, really a key word that I would ask you to remember is the word context. Historians or students of history must learn to appreciate context. That for every piece of evidence we have, whether we're talking about a written text or a bit of archaeological evidence, some material remains, or a piece of art, or even an oral tradition that was invented at some time in the past. We have to understand it properly, to understand why it does the things that it does, and in other words, to understand the way the people of the past operated, we have to have an appreciation for their context. We have to know what was going on around them. What kind of political system did they belong to? What were the economic circumstances? What can we say about the demographics of their situation? What kind of society did they live in other words? What were the influences of culture on them? What was their religion? What was their belief system? And we can't always know all of those things in great detail. We can speculate on them, but we try to educate ourselves as much as we possibly can in the context, and then take that context into our study of the source material. Two other terms that I would encourage you to learn and to appreciate here are primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources are things that come from the time period in question. And you might think, okay, like journals or newspapers or something like that. And the answer would be yes, those are good examples. But for African history, we don't have a lot of written records. Most of the peoples of Africa were pre-literate all the way up until the 19th century, and even thereafter in some cases. That doesn't mean they didn't have a culture. They actually had a very highly developed oral culture. They had ways of remembering things that were quite reliable. And people who had privileged positions in the society were tasked, indeed, with remembering important details. And so that was all part of their culture. Well, we have to understand things like that, right? We have to know what the available primary sources are. In the case of Africa, we also have to adopt particular methodologies to make sense of things like oral traditions or archaeology or whatever it is that we happen to have at our disposal. And so I will delve into this to some extent in class. We'll talk about this, the problems of source material and what we can do to try to overcome that. And in some cases, this is a really daunting task, but it's still worth trying to surmount those obstacles. This class is a writing-intensive class. That means that at least 50% of the grade will come from things based on writing assignments. One of the requirements for a writing-intensive class is you have to produce papers around 15 pages or so, and so the class will require three papers, each about 5 pages long. Anyway, and it'll also be, writing will be evaluated for content, form, style, correctness, and overall writing proficiency and everything like that. Required texts and supplemental readings. What do you have to read for this class? Well, there is a textbook. You can see John Iliff, Africans, The History of a Continent. This is a textbook that surveys African history. It's one of the shorter ones. I think it's quite accessible. Iliff does adopt a certain perspective in that book. He looks especially at the impact of environment on African history, and so you should be aware that that is a theme. He also talks a lot about population, about demographics, about things like disease and famine, which come up over and over again in African history, and so these are the things that he's going to focus on, and so he has an approach that he's adopting for all of that. And then the other four sources here, the other four books, are all sources. Okay, some of these are what we would call primary sources of the time period. Others are, they're primary sources from a certain perspective, but the last three of these at least are novels. Okay, they're novels that explore particular periods of African history. The first one was an oral tradition that was passed down for many centuries and finally written down in the 20th century. But it covers events that happened in the 13th century in Mali, the Kingdom of Mali in West Africa. And so that is a source that is of some antiquity. It's a medieval source, but it has been, of course, redacted through numerous keepers of the oral tradition. And so we have to be aware of that. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, some of you may have read this before. This is a fairly classic reading even for high school students, a novel written in the late 1950s, and it explores kind of the cusp of Africans as they made contact with Europeans, and I think is a truly beautiful book, and we'll try to use that to understand that important period of time. Kamara Laye's The Dark Child, about a Senegalese boy who is caught sort of between the forces of colonialism in the early 20th century and the forces of traditional African society. And then finally, Boubacar Boris Diop's Murambi, The Book of Bones, which is a novel about the Rwandan genocide. Now, these are the texts that you will have to write papers on. And so, looking down here at the requirements, we'll talk about that. Okay. So, what are the requirements for this course? Oh, by the way, there are other electronic readings. If we come down to the daily schedule here, you'll see that there are daily readings, and so. You're probably watching this around the first day of class. We're looking at the syllabus here and discussing some of the issues of African history. We've already done that a little bit. You'll see for the second class you need to read Iliff Chapter 1, and I will have a lecture, or we'll have a class discussion on geography and historical problems of pre-modern Africa. And then Iliff Chapter 2, and so there's a daily reading schedule. Now, there are several moments here I think there are about 5 of them, where there will be some online readings. This says LMS. I apologize, that should not be there. In fact, I'm going to eliminate it right now. LMS is the Old Learning Management System. These will be posted on Canvas, and so I'm going to just write that here. So that will be on Canvas, and there are a few others here. Okay, here's another one. Make a change there, right? So anywhere you see Canvas or LMS, you'll note that you need to read something on Canvas. These are not short things, or sorry, these are not long things. I should say most of these are just a few paragraphs or a few pages long, but those are other sources that we need to deal with. Okay. So you'll see how this works. You'll have an Iliff reading for most days, and then there will be points in the term when you need to read the longer source, and then there will be a paper due on that, right? The first assignment, however, is a geography quiz. A basic knowledge of geography is really important for the study of history. You need to know where things are, put simply, right? And so I have given you here in the syllabus a geography quiz study sheet. It's toward the end of the syllabus here. And this includes all modern nations of Africa by current name. I think there are 53 or 54 nations in Africa. And then a few cities here, about 15 or so cities, I think, maybe 20. And a few bodies of water, and a few mountain ranges. Okay. Now, I should say this is a quiz that is going to require you to study, unless you already have a really intimate knowledge of African geography. You're going to have to study for this pretty hard. I do allow you to take it twice. The first time is a week after class begins, and so the 15th of May here, you see, we're going to take the geography quiz for the first time. That happens to be the day that I will begin teaching the class in the classroom. And so, hopefully that's not too much of, or too shocking an introduction, but that will be the first take, and then a week later we will have take 2, okay? Now, how do you study for this, and what is the quiz going to look like? That's probably what you're asking. Well, basically I'm going to have some maps, and I'm going to put numbers on them and ask you to identify those things. There will not be a word bank. You're not going to have this in front of you as you're taking it. It's either you know it or you don't. Let's go over to a web browser here, and you'll see that I pulled up Africa blank map. And I will tell you right off the bat that the maps that I use for the quiz are on here. This one, or something that looks very much like this. Now note that there was a country created in 2011 called South Sudan. This is Sudan right here, and it runs something, like follow the pointer here, something like this, right? It's just the southern part of Sudan. So that'll be the only modification here. So I'll use this map that shows all of the nations, and I will use that for the cities as well. And then I will also use this map, and you can click on these, okay? This has the rivers on it, and I will draw a little, the Atlas Mountains are up here, so I'll draw little triangles for the mountains. Down here is the Drakensberg Mountains and the Great Rift Valleys up here, and so forth and so on. And so I will draw in some of these geographic features, right? And so probably a good idea to print off some of these blank maps or something like that and just start to label them. This is the white Nile, this is the blue Nile, sorry, this is the white Nile, here's just the Nile River, this is the Niger River, this is the Benue River, this is the Volta River, this is the Congo, this is the Zambezi, this is the Limpopo, this is the Orange River, and so forth and so on, right? So that you are able to identify all of those and then study with those blank maps. So that's the geography quiz. Feel free to email me with questions you might have about that, but I think it's pretty straightforward. It's you know it or you don't. The quiz will have 50 questions on it. Each of those questions will count for a half point, giving you 25 points total. I let you take it twice. I keep the higher of the two scores. If you score better the first time than the second time, you get to keep your first score. If you score higher the second time, you keep the second score. So don't stress too much about taking it a second time and whether you're going to get better or not. Hopefully you will get better, but you keep the higher of the two scores. In addition to the geography quiz, the main assignments are these source explorations. I'm going to change this. These are, that was a typo. These are roughly 5-page double-spaced analytical papers on assigned sources. Okay. I do have prompts. In fact, I have them already in Canvas. I don't know, and so if we come up here to Files in Canvas, okay. You'll see that there are prompts for all 4 papers. Now I say 4. You only have to do 3, but there will be 4 sources that we will read, and you have 4 assigned papers. You only have to write on 3 of them. If you want to write on all 4, I will count your 3 highest scores. That is, I will drop the lowest score. And so it might be a good idea to write all 4, but that is not required. So you can take a look at those prompts and start to get accustomed to the kinds of requirements that are that happen in this class. There's also a film review. The film we're going to watch in class, the film Yesterday, which is about the AIDS crisis in Southern Africa in the 1980s. You need to write a film review. At the end of the syllabus here, I have provided for you a film review guideline set that you can use, that you can consult as you prepare the film review. And then there will be a final exam. A midterm and a final, which will consist of a variety of essay questions. Again, if we look down here at the schedule, you'll see that the midterm will take place on the 25th of May, and the final will actually be a take-home final that is due the Monday after classes release, June 26th, I believe that was. I also grade on participation, and so try to make comments. Certainly come with the reading done, prepared for class, ready to make comments. I will exempt you from this the first week of class since we're not going to be meeting in class, but please do come with your questions and your comments and engage the class. There aren't very many students in this class, and so it's going to be important for us to have some kind of conversation. More than 2 absences will affect this grade, this component adversely. In other words, I start docking points off of your participation grade if you miss more than 2 classes. I will say if you miss a lot of classes, that's the best way to fail the class in general, because there's a lot of information being conveyed, and if you want to do well in papers and exams, you really need to be up to speed on all of that. I'm not going to take time to look through all of this. I've got some information here about what I think is a DFCBA papers. You might want to take a look at that. Here's the grading scale. Classroom etiquette can really be summed up with, just a few things. Don't text in class or anything like that. I'm okay with you having electronic devices as long as you're using them for class purposes, taking notes, or whatever. Academic honesty. Now, shoot. Okay, this should have been taken out. I'm not going to make you submit things to turnitin.com directly because submitting it to Canvas is all you need to do. Okay. So Canvas automatically runs everything through Turnitin.com, so it checks it for plagiarism and all of that. And so I am doing some editing on the fly here as we go through this. Okay. If you do have a disability, please see Ms. Francisco in the Disabilities Office or the Office of Services for Students with Disabilities, and she will get you squared away there, and I certainly will make any and all accommodations necessary for that. Okay. So please feel free to email me if you have questions. I do have a late policy. I penalize 1 letter grade through the first week late, and then 2 letter grades thereafter. And so, you can turn things in late. You will still get credit. You will get docked in some cases significantly for that. So. All right, I guess that is all that I have to say for this. Hopefully I didn't leave anything too terribly important out, and I will post some other lectures on Canvas, or rather on YouTube with links on Canvas shortly. It'll take us through the first week of information. Thank you.